Thursday Night Football is on, and it's only on Prime Video.
Touchdown.
This week, the new-look New England Patriots take on the reloaded New York Jets in an intense divisional matchup.
What a catch.
Coverage begins at 7 p.m. Eastern with TNF Tonight, presented by Verizon. Not a Prime member? Sign up for a 30-day free trial to stream the game. It's the Patriots and Jets, Thursday at 7, only on Prime Video. Restrictions apply. See Amazon.com/Amazon Prime for details.
Canva presents a work love story like no other. Meet Productivity. She's all business.
The Canva doc is done.
Creativity is more of a free thinker.
Whiteboard brainstorm.
They're worlds apart, but sometimes opposites attract. Thanks to Canva.
The data is in the deck.
And now it's an animated graph.
Canva, where productivity meets creativity. Now showing on computer screens everywhere. Love your work at canva.com.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 a month and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. Shout out to my parents, Will and Yolanda, for becoming the first Patreon subscribers. You guys are awesome, and I love you. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Capital punishment has existed in various forms throughout human history and is intended, at least in theory, to act as a deterrent to would-be criminals, that the punishment for certain acts is severe. Of all the forms of capital punishment, perhaps none is more cruel or torturous than crucifixion, which is defined as, quote, the execution of a person by nailing or binding them to a cross, end quote. You heard that right. Crucifixion involves nailing an individual's feet, sometimes stacked one atop the other, and their hands or wrists, with arms stretched outward, to a wooden cross. If a person didn't initially die of shock and blood loss while being affixed to the cross, they would eventually succumb to asphyxiation. The Romans practiced and perfected crucifixion for nearly 500 years before it was abolished in the 4th century AD by Constantine. Without a doubt, the most famous victim of Roman crucifixion was Jesus Christ, whose death has long held spiritual significance for Christians throughout history. In addition to traditional crucifixion wounds, the New Testament Gospels reveal Jesus endured a pre-crucifixion scourging and suffered a crown of thorns atop his head, and, after dying, had his side pierced by a spear. It was a truly agonizing experience. Did you know the Roman Catholic Church officially recognizes more than 300 stigmatics, or stigmatists, individuals who, through no creation of their own, bear the marks, scars, and wounds of Jesus Christ on their body. In fact, the first stigmatist in recorded history was Saint Francis of Assisi, who died in 1226 AD. Tradition holds that stigmatics are deeply devout and pious, and that bearing the marks of Christ are a blessing, even though their appearance often brings pain and suffering. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the unnerving phenomenon of stigmata and consider 3 real-life cases. Are stigmata real, or nothing more than religious hysteria? And does the appearance of stigmata indicate God's blessings, or are they cruel and torturous? I'll share the details. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. In 1999, the phenomenon was brought into the collective cultural consciousness with the release of Stigmata, starring Patricia Arquette and Gabriel Byrne. A horror movie, the film depicts an irreligious woman who begins to inexplicably bear the marks of Christ. A sort of possession tale, the movie had a few effective scares, even if the overall plot was straight out of a Hollywood studio. Though, in fairness, the spontaneous appearance of wounds and pain is downright scary. Imagine for a moment that you wake up one morning, your sheets covered in blood, and your head, hands, and feet oozing from wounds that appeared out of nowhere. To me, at least, the thought is terrifying. But for stigmatics, their affliction is seen less as a curse and more as a blessing. One article stated stigmata is, quote, a sign that they have been specially chosen by God to suffer the same wounds his son did, end quote. The word stigmata comes from the Greek and means, quote, mark, spot, or brand, end quote. According to Britannica Encyclopedia, stigmata, quote, correspond to those of the crucified Jesus Christ. That is, on the hands, on the feet, near the heart, and sometimes on the head, from the crown of thorns, or shoulders and back, from carrying the cross and scourging, end quote, end quote. The presence of stigmata is often interpreted as a sign that the individual is sharing in the suffering of Christ, and a true stigmatic is often considered a person of virtue who demonstrates religious devotion and piety. In researching stigmata, I came across several interesting details. The term stigmata originates from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatian church, where he writes, quote, from now on, let no one cause trouble for me, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus, end quote. There were no recorded cases of stigmata for the first 1,200 years of Christian church history. And in fact, of all the recorded cases of stigmata, nearly 80% of stigmatics are women. What's interesting is that not all stigmatics exhibit the same wounds. Some exhibit the 5 sacred wounds of Christ, while others only show a few. Some stigmatics experience tears of blood, or sweating drops of blood. And for some, the wounds do not clot and, quote, seemed to stay fresh and uninfected. End quote. Something interesting. The odor associated with the wounds is often described as pleasant, and in several cases were said to smell like flowers. This is called the odor of sanctity. In some cases, stigmatics experience other scary phenomenon. For many, the bleeding starts and stops again, with no discernible pattern for when and where they appear. Other stigmatics exhibit an extreme form of fasting, claiming to live with minimal or no food, and in some cases, no water for long periods of time. Other stigmatics claim to have, quote, invisible stigmata, end quote, during which they feel the pain of wounds despite having no visible or external marks. And still other stigmatics experienced, quote, a spontaneous regression and closure of their stigmata in the days following their death, end quote. Perhaps the most well-known and famous stigmatists are Saint Francis of Assisi and Padre Pio. Volumes have been written about their respective experiences with stigmata. But for this episode, we're going to explore three not as famous, though equally fascinating stigmatists: James Bruce, Natuzza Evolo, and Therese Newman. According to one article, quote, there have only been 3 known stigmatic priests in the 20th century, and Father James Bruce is one of them, end quote. In November 1991, while visiting his parents' home, Bruce noticed that whenever he walked in the room, the religious statues would weep water from their eyes. At first, it was one statue. But then, anytime he was near a religious statue, it too would weep water. Eyewitnesses claimed to see these statues weeping whenever he came near. Several months later, in the spring of 1992, Bruce began experiencing sharp pains in his wrists, and shortly after, quote, blood began to seep from the unbroken skin on his wrists, feet, and his right side, end quote. Despite the pain, Bruce considered this a blessing for several reasons. 1. Bruce claimed to have the power of healing, spiritually and physically. And 2, Bruce claimed the stigmata gave him the power to bring people back to the church. What's interesting, though, is that the Roman Catholic Church has never released an official statement confirming or denying the authenticity of Bruce's stigmata. One article stated, quote, the diocesan chancery in Virginia did not make any claims about the authenticity of the stigmata. And because there wasn't an obvious religious message attached to Bruce receiving the stigmata, they were not willing to put out any ecclesiastical declarations about the situation, end quote. A Washington Post article dated June 1st, 1995 confirmed this, stating, quote, the Roman Catholic Church has not acknowledged the events as miracles, and neither believers nor skeptics have confirmed whether they were real or a hoax, end quote. In 1993, the stigmata disappeared as quickly and as unexpectedly as it appeared. To this day, Father James Bruce claims his experiences were genuine and real. Born in 1924 in Calabria, Italy, Natuzza Evolo was born into poverty and scandal. Evolo and her siblings were known as bastard children because they were fatherless. The family's financial limitations forced Natuzza to work and not attend school, leaving her illiterate for her entire life. She was pious from an early age, and it was reported that at the age of 6, she was, quote, given the gift of being able to see Jesus, the Virgin Mary, angels, and saints. In 1934, when Natuza was 10 years old, her mother was arrested, and she and her siblings were thrown out of their home. Now homeless and caring for her siblings, Natuza prayed to the Madonna to help her find a place to stay. While praying, she heard a voice say aloud, quote, "Courage, I will find you a place to live," end quote. And within a few days, she found shelter at a local commune. It was reported that at her first Holy Communion, Natuza's mouth, quote, filled with blood when the wafer symbolizing the body of Christ was placed inside, end quote. Starting in her teenage years and continuing to the end of her life, Natuza began experiencing stigmata. In her case, the wounds were bloody and painful and appeared, quote, every Friday and through the entirety of Lent, end quote, during which she kept herself hidden away because the pain was too unbearable. Natuza Evolo claimed to have healing powers, and it was reported she could simply look at a person and accurately diagnose their ailments, using proper medical terminology. Not only that, but she could also heal the person, or tell the person how to be healed. And in some cases, she predicted the future and spoke in languages she had never heard or studied before. This is especially interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, Natuza Evolo was illiterate. She couldn't read or write. Natuza was also believed to experience bilocation, or the phenomenon of being in two places at the same time. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Natuza Evolo's stigmata was her ability to produce hemography, or, quote, the process whereby blood from the stigmata or bloody sweat is miraculously formed into Christian writing, images, and symbols upon handkerchiefs, bandages, and more, end quote. It is believed that blood produced from stigmata correspond to the wounds of Christ, and because of this, hemography often represents, quote, the mysteries of the Christian faith, end quote. In its simplest sense, hemography occurs when a handkerchief or bandage touches the bleeding wounds of a stigmatic. The blood transfers to the handkerchief or bandage, and when it is removed, the blood forms the shape of Christian signs or symbols. While researching, I found several photographs of Natuza Evolo's hemography. One handkerchief had several signs, including a heart with a cross atop, a single cross, a crown of thorns, and what appears to be a man with a halo around his head and holding a cross in his left arm. For years, people who visited Natuza requested she produce hemographies. However, it appears that she was unable to do this on command. Over nearly 70 years, Natuza Evolo produced over 1,000 hemographies. And though she could not produce them by request, there were witnesses to the phenomenon, including Maria Mantelli, who visited Natuza in 1972. Quote, I can definitely assure you about the authenticity of this phenomenon. That handkerchief was mine. I had just taken it out of my bag. And much more than this, the phenomenon had taken place under my own eyes. Moreover, it had appeared in the middle of the folded handkerchief, perfectly traced with no bloodstains around. I really can't explain that." End quote. Natuza Avolo experienced stigmata and hemography for over 70 years, until her death in 2009. There are many who believe her powers were real, and point to the fact that she never accepted money for what she did, nor was she accused of being fraudulent. But, as with all things, her doubters weren't so sure. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church hasn't made any official declarations about Natuza's stigmata, though she had strong support from her local bishops. And when she died in 2009, over 100 priests attended her funeral, along with tens of thousands of supporters. Born in 1898 in Bavaria, Therese Neumann was the oldest of 10 children, and because of this, took on a caretaking role for her siblings after her father was drafted into military service in World War I. Growing up, her desire was to be a missionary in Africa. However, in 1918, when Therese was just 20 years old, tragedy struck. She was severely injured in a fire and suffered partial paralysis and blindness, leaving her bedridden. With her dreams of becoming a missionary no longer a possibility, Therese focused on becoming as devout a follower of God as possible. In 1925, Therese claimed to hear the voice of Saint Therese of Lisieux. One article stated, quote, "She asked her if she wanted to be better, and Therese, of course, answered, yes. The saint told her she could now stand and see, but she'd still suffer." End quote. This was perhaps a major understatement. On the first day of Lent in 1926, Therese was sick with the flu, and while in her room, she reported feeling, quote, "a divine ecstasy," end quote. Over the course of the day, she noticed blood on her nightgown coming from a wound on her side and above her heart, which bled continually. On the third day of Lent, wounds on her hands appeared, and on the next day, she began weeping tears of blood. Several months later, her forehead began to bleed, corresponding to the crown of thorns. Prior to the appearance of each wound, Therese claimed to have visions of Jesus at the Mount of Olives. Therese's suffering began and continued for 36 years. As if the wounds and constant bleeding weren't enough suffering, Saint Therese of Lisieux appeared and told her, quote, "No more earthly food. You'll survive on the Eucharist." End quote. From 1926 to 1962, Therese Neumann claimed to survive only on the Eucharist, a small wafer, and wine. On September 18, 1962, Therese Neumann died from cardiac arrest, and, as is often the case, the Roman Catholic Church has not issued an official proclamation on Therese Neumann's stigmata. Stigmata is an exceptionally rare occurrence, and I mentioned earlier that there have only been a few hundred stigmatics recognized by the Catholic Church since the 1200s. But none of these truths answer the question, is stigmata real? For believers, stigmata and the accompanying supernatural powers are a divine miracle, pointing them to Christ and affirming their faith. In fact, stigmata can be understood as a unique intersection where humanity meets the divine. But for skeptics, stigmata is hardly miraculous, and in many cases has been proven to be an elaborate hoax. Depending on your research, a range of explanations have been offered to debunk stigmata, from fake wounds to religious hysteria to dissociative identity disorder. A Guardian article dated October 13, 2004, cited a common criticism. Quote, "Stigmata sufferers' wounds correspond more closely to religious art than they do genuine Roman crucifixion techniques. Christ would have been pierced through the wrist and ankles, rather than his hands and feet." End quote. The medical community affirms certain medical conditions can account for elements of stigmata. Hematidrosis, for example, is a condition where an individual sweats drops of blood. Spontaneous bruises, called psychogenic purpura, can account for the supposed wounds on one's hands and feet. In the case of Therese Newman, doctors examined her in the late 1920s, with one describing her as, quote, "a hysteric," end quote. A group of investigators, including bishops and doctors, observed Newman in her home and found her behavior odd and suspicious, as the blood from the wounds would only appear after they were asked to leave the room. It was suggested that her stigmata were the result of a form of, quote, "unconscious self-mutilation through abnormal autosuggestibility," end quote. In other words, Therese Newman willed the wounds to appear on her body. Newman's claim to have only ingested the Eucharist for the last 36 years of her life also came under scrutiny. In 1927, she was physically examined for 15 days and was observed to have not eaten anything. At the start of the observation period, Newman weighed 121 pounds, which dropped to 112.5 pounds over the course of a few days. However, on the last day, her weight had returned to normal, suggesting food and water intake. After this initial observation, Newman's family refused permission to conduct additional tests. I've said it in previous episodes that while I have great respect for the scientific community, there are simply aspects of life that cannot be easily or neatly explained away. And I suppose that's the great chasm between belief and denial. Sometimes, the answer lies outside the binary of true and false, belief and unbelief. Truly, I don't know what to make of stigmata. Is it possible stigmata has a normal, medical, and scientific explanation? Of course. Is it possible, though, that stigmata has a paranormal, unusual, even divine explanation? Of course. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. Are stigmata real, or nothing more than religious hysteria? And does the appearance of stigmata indicate God's blessings? Or are they cruel and torturous? What do you think? I've shared the details. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.